Morning, my name is Maurice Crespi. I'm the managing partner of Schindler's Attorneys. We joined today by Ian Fleming of Engaged, Dominique from Schindler's Attorneys, Francois from the IQ Business Group, Peter Gordon from Engaged, and Gary Baruchowitz from the IQ Business Group. The idea today is to discuss businesses in distress, the various options to businesses in distress. I see somebody's just raised their hand, all's good. And to go through business rescue and the legislation that governs business rescue, but not with a view to suggesting that business rescue is necessarily appropriate. In fact, COBRA is all about keeping businesses out of rescue. The idea is to encourage businesses to go into the COBRA environment, have the businesses allow our mediators to engage the creditors of your business, bring those creditors into the COBRA environment, and try and negotiate through the supply chain all the way up to the banks to ensure that every business within the supply chain survives. Business rescue is primarily about the moratorium on claims against the company. So in this climate where it's an act of God and it's not fault-based, the circumstances are not fault-based, it would be unreasonable for a creditor to threaten a liquidation. And it's only in those circumstances where business rescue would be appropriate. There are other circumstances like post-commencement finance that we'll get into, but it's to level the playing fields. It's to ensure that there isn't a disparity in bargaining power. So COBRA, we'll discuss business rescue, but COBRA is actually about an informal business rescue to try and avoid it. So I'm going to kick off by asking Peter to run through the business rescue process at a very high level, and then we'll go into the important details. Peter?
Morning, Maurice and everybody. Thanks for joining us. A business rescue, high level, in terms of Chapter 6 of the Companies Act. As Maurice rightly says, it gives you an absolute moratorium against legal action against the company. It's not only people trying to recover money from you, it's any legal action. There are certain conditions under which the company can land up in court, but by and large, protection. A business rescue practitioner is appointed. The directors, the two ways to go into business rescue, either by way of a business director's resolution, very straightforward. The directors decide that the company is financially distressed, defined as can't pay your debts as and when they fall due over the next 6 months. You can then, or that in the next 6 months, the assets of the company fairly valued will be less than the liabilities of the company fairly valued, can apply for business rescue. It's a matter of doing the resolution. Directors also sign an affidavit. The important thing in the affidavit is the directors have to state that they believe that the company has a chance of survival, that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And on that basis, that gets filed, i.e. an email is sent to Sub-C stating that the company is in business rescue. There's a couple of forms to fill in, both for the rescue and for the appointment of a practitioner. And thereafter, we talk about a line in the sand. Everybody that's owed money as of that date is immediately frozen. All security is frozen. Doesn't impact or change the security if the creditors are secured, but they're frozen. They cannot be paid other than in terms of the business rescue plan. A practitioner is important, quite an important decision of the directors. Make sure you're appointing somebody who not only understands the legal side of business rescue, but to be honest, is a practical businessman, because it is business as usual with the practitioner on board. There's just the protection granted to the company to allow it to trade out of its current problems. A business rescue plan is then put together that goes through a vote of creditors. I'm not going to deal too much about the voting process at the moment, but the majority of guys have got to say, yes, we're happy with the plan, and the practitioner then implements the plan. Once the plan is implemented and the business rescue comes to an end, what is termed the substantial completion. So the minor details might still be outstanding, but the practitioner then is allowed to take the company out of rescue. Once again, a form gets sent to SIPC to do so. The other important thing with a business rescue is how to fund it, and that's post-rescue finance. I'm not going to cover that now. I'm sure Maurice will pick it up as we go through. But that in a nutshell is business rescue.
Great, thanks for that, Peter. So one of the take-homes, and we'll go through various take-homes in relation to business rescue, but one of the very, very important take-homes is the moratorium, and the fact that the moratorium will only apply to contracts if they've been suspended by the business rescue practitioner. So a good example is a lease agreement. The lease remains in place and you're still obliged to pay rental until the business rescue practitioner sends out a notice suspending it. So if you were to go to a business rescue practitioner outside of COBRA, it would be important to make sure that the business rescue practitioner is aware of the requirement, firstly, and secondly, to be armed with a list of all of your creditors or counterparties to agreements, so that the business rescue can immediately write to the counterparties to the agreements and have those contracts suspended. Once those contracts are suspended, the counterparty cannot do anything whilst the company is in business rescue, other than apply to court to convert the business rescue into a liquidation. So important take home on that score. The necessity, there's a requirement, and I can't recall whether Peter touched it, but there's a requirement that one has to put business rescue to the vote if you're financially distressed. And bear in mind, financially distressed is a low benchmark. All that's required is that you're unable to pay your debts as and when they fall due within the ensuing season, or it's reasonably likely that you'll be unable to pay. So you have to put it to the vote, and if you vote, the directors vote against business rescue, they have to send a notice to the employees and the creditors setting out why. Why is it that you're financially distressed, but you're not taking the step to put the company into business rescue? And COBRA is that excuse. COBRA is that reason. We have a notice that you write to your creditors and you say, we're not going into business rescue because we're in the COBRA environment. So your first statutory obligation is to put business rescue to the vote the moment you are distressed. And if you want to say no to business rescue, there's an easy way of doing it, and that is to say, I'm in the COBRA environment, and the notice, in fact, says we invite you as creditor to come into the COBRA environment so that our qualified mediators can negotiate the payment arrangement. When I say qualified, properly qualified, academically qualified, and with experience. Another topic which is on everybody's minds and on this score, please, this is a webinar. The idea behind webinars is that you participate and that you ask questions that are industry specific. Otherwise, we could just pre-record this and just play it every single day. I mean, there would be no point in it being a webinar. So please ask those questions. I'm going to be moving on to employees, but before I do, I just want to welcome Carl Bates. He's from the CIDAR Group. He's just joined us as a panelist. The CIDAR Group, one of the partners who are assisting on a pro bono basis. They were one of the first initial partners to jump on board. Now we have countless partners. And again, very, very important, COBRA has the likes of the expertise as the CIDAR Group has, and that expertise is available to businesses. So be mindful on that. Employees. Ian, can you take us through how you as a business rescue practitioner deal with employees?
Certainly, Maurice. In terms of, just from a practical perspective, once the business rescue practitioner has been appointed, which needs to happen 5 business days after it's gone into business rescue. From a practical perspective, the business rescue practitioner has to have a meeting with the employees 10 business days after his appointment. He has to have a meeting with the creditors and he has to have a meeting with the employees. employees meeting can either happen if the employees are represented by a trade union, then it can happen with a trade union representative, or it can happen with a employees representative. And that's normally the way we do it. And the purpose of that meeting is to inform the employees, as we did with the creditors, whether we believe the company has a reasonable prospect of being rescued, in other words, of being returned to a solvent going concern, or of creditors receiving a better return than they would get in liquidation. And that obviously has an impact on whether the employees will continue to be employed. Now, it's obviously a very sensitive issue that needs to be handled very carefully. Any retrenchments that are envisaged are most of the time communicated to the employees at that meeting. And whether the company is in business rescue or not, in other words, whether it's in the COBRA environment pre-business rescue or whether it has gone into business rescue, what we can do is we can fast track the process of engaging with employees as part of the 189 process to explore alternatives to retrenchment. And what we've been doing quite successfully is proposing as an alternative to retrenchment that the employees basically take a haircut on their salaries or a reduction on their salaries. In some cases, quite a vast reduction, in fact. And you know, with the prospect of having a job at the end of the day, as opposed to being retrenched now. We've also found in a lot of cases that the companies don't actually have sufficient financial resources to be able to pay the retrenchment packages now. So employees have been very receptive to taking a reduction in their salaries now, with the hope that once the crisis is over, or once we're coming out the crisis, then we can gradually up their salaries to hopefully a level where they were earning before. But yes, employees in business rescue, there's no difference in the treatment of employees in business rescue versus pre-business rescue. So that's a very important thing to note. One of the things that business rescue does not change is the way in which employees are treated. I hope that answers your question, Maurice. Maurice, are you there?
I am. I do that far too often. On the question of employees, let's just go through the law. So importantly, the law still applies to employees. Employees are treated in the exact same manner as, in terms of our law, they must be treated in the same manner as they were before. And if you are to vary any employment terms, it's important that you seek agreement from the staff. You cannot unilaterally impose variations to any contractual arrangement that you have with your employees. So the way it works is Section 189 of the Labour Relations Act that applies to retrenchments. It deals with retrenchments. It talks about dismissals based on operational requirements. That section is also of application when it comes to your intention to vary contracts. What the board does is the board will start a consultative process with their employees with a view to varying, let's say, their salary. The consultative process will be done in a manner where an alternative, you present an alternative, the board presents as an alternative to dismissal, the possibility of a lower salary, be it temporary. And if the employee does not accept that, then a retrenchment becomes necessary, and then you'd have to pay that salary, or sorry, the severance pay, which could be quite costly. And on that score, I'll move over to Peter just to deal with the costs of how the severance costs are dealt with, and importantly, PCF, post-commencement finance. Peter?
Yes, PCF, quite a critical part of any business rescue. If you can't fund the rescue, then a rescue is going to fail. So in the early days of appointment, and if he's been introduced to the company beforehand, a practitioner is going to spend a bit of time working out how to fund the whole process of rescue. And fund the process of rescue, we're not only talking about the costs of the business rescue practitioner himself or anybody that he appoints to assist him. We're talking about how to fund the working capital and capital needs of the business going forward. Now, the immediate release of PCF is obviously because, as I said earlier, you've frozen all your liabilities. So the money that you would have paid out in the next 30 to 60 days no longer has to be paid over to creditors and is then available to fund the rescue. Once that amount has been established, if it's insufficient, the practitioner then, and certainly Ian and I who do a lot of joint rescues ourselves, is going to have a very urgent meeting with the bank very early on in the process. And first of all, to advise them, well, they're going to have been advised in terms of the notice to all creditors. That's assuming you owe the bank money. But even if you don't, we will advise the bank that the company's in rescue and then discuss with them how to fund the process. So early communication with the banks is essential, and that will normally lead to a smoother relationship with the bank as to continuing the working capital facilities, continuing to operate the bank account. In the early days of rescues, the banks ran scared and a lot of bank accounts were frozen. And obviously, if your account is frozen, you have to negotiate very rapidly with the bank to make sure you have access to your funds. They still do that, certainly in a situation where the bank have got security or GNB, general notarial bond over the debtors of the company, or maybe even a cession of the debtors. They will freeze the bank account because obviously any deposits from those debtors belong to the bank. So essential to talk to the bank. If the shareholder or directors are thinking about putting money into the company, then please don't do that before rescue. Because once you put money into the company post-rescue, it's immediately preferred. And by preferred, we mean that within the business rescue process, the people who have provided PCF need to be repaid. So an important point there, any money coming in to keep the thing going, to pay, for example, the staff or to pay essential suppliers, do that in rescue rather than outside of rescue. The trick with employees is quite often a company cannot afford to pay employees their redundancy payments, and then it's pertinent for the rescue practitioner to insert those in the cash flow forecast at a time when the company can afford it and negotiate that with the employees. The practitioner's also got unfettered access to the free assets of the business. So the other important point is trying to find somebody to fund the PCF. The practitioner can use the assets that aren't already secured as security for anybody that's coming in. So a PCF funder who's provided funding and then is granted security as well becomes what we call super preferent, because they have to be paid out of the realization of those assets, whatever assets have been used as a security, before anybody else. They then are also preferred. Any balance remaining is preferred in the rescue. And I'd say in the rescue, and that's an important term, because in the rescue means whilst the company's still in rescue. If the company were to go into liquidation, then obviously the normal waterfall would apply, but those PCF creditors who have taken security come to the top of the pile, and then the normal liquidation process of secured and preferent and concurrent creditors would apply.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter.
Anything there?
No. Thanks, Peter. So that's generally that's a broad overview of business rescue. That's the take homes there when it comes to PCF and the considerations by the board. Importantly, the board has the legal obligation to put the company to the vote, or business rescue to the vote. What we'd like to move on to now is the presentation by Carl Bates on the topic, your crisis, your board, your assumptions. He's going to be presenting and dealing with the present crisis, but more in relation to the strategies that can be employed and the questions that one needs to ask in this climate. So I'm going to hand over to him. Carl, thank you very much. You're on mute.
Thanks very much, Maurice, and thanks very much, everyone, for the contribution so far this morning. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar and for having this discussion around your crisis, your board, your assumptions. Certainly one of the things that we are engaging across the market at the moment is the role of directors, the role of boards, and the role of chief executives and management teams in making decisions around how to progress through business rescue, through liquidation, through not getting to business rescue, as has been talked about by a couple of the panelists already, and finding ways to avoid having to step into that space. But so often all of these approaches and all of these discussions have a foundation in the assumptions that you are making as a director, as a manager, as a shareholder in relation to your business. So just a context, the Sadar Group is a leader in the education, appointment and guidance of high performance boards of privately held companies, family businesses, listed and public entities. And really bring to this particular conversation around assumptions and insight into the discussions and the challenges we're seeing in the boards we're supporting around South Africa and indeed around the world through this process of COVID-19. So in terms of this particular discussion this morning, I want to bring three key elements to the table to enable you as business leaders to navigate through what we're calling this blizzard, navigate through the blizzard, if you like. And that to be practical, be applicable, and be evaluating. I think it's really easy when we start talking about the role of a director or the role of a shareholder or the role of a manager for that matter in this COVID-19 crisis to get caught up in the technicalities around how we are responding. And I think sometimes when we just break it back down to the fundamentals and keep it practical, applicable, and ultimately evaluating, we're able to navigate through the process even more effectively. And so with that in mind, I'm not going to spend time on the crisis. COVID-19 is here. It's affecting our businesses in one way or another. But I think the one thing that we constantly are reminding customers and clients is that it's very easy to get caught in this is having a negative impact on your business. For some reason, or for some rather, there are opportunities being presented. And certainly we are working with clients that have seen significant uptake or uplift in their business through this process. And I think it's important to make sure that one of your assumptions through this journey is not that it's going not that it's guaranteed to negatively affect every business. And I think some of the discussion and some of the approach to the assumptions being made by many businesses that we're engaging with are that this is a negative output. Obviously, for many, there are serious threats to business sustainability, and that is what COBRA is here to support and guide business through. So without spending time on the crisis, let's talk about your role as directors and your role as boards through this process. And there's this quote that we often use within the Sadar Group around this idea that good directors grow companies, but great directors change lives. And I think it's, again, really easy through this process to get caught up in the business jargon of our response as directors to this crisis. And I think it's really important for us to remember that at the end of the day, our role as directors and our role as governors of this thing called a company, this thing called a legal entity, or in the eyes of the law, a legal person, is to change the lives of everyone that business impacts, whether it be our customers, whether it be our employees, or our wider stakeholder group. And the challenge, I suppose, in this environment is how are you responding as a business? How are you responding as a director? And what are the assumptions that you're making to have a positive impact on the lives of those that your business, that the business that you're involved in or that you're advising or that you're directing is impacting? And so ultimately, it's your board that makes, particularly where we are the shareholder, where we are the director, where we are the manager, where we wear all three hats, as we would say at the Sadar Group, we get caught up missing the fact that ultimately the core decisions around this process, particularly if you're in control of it, as opposed to having it put on you by stakeholders making the decision for you, if you're leading and driving this discussion, whether you are one director or several directors, you are the board that directs this journey. How you understand your role and execute it will make the difference to your success or your failure in this process. And so I want to spend a little bit of time just understanding how to break up the decision making that you're going through as a business. And I think a good place to start is just to remember that governance ultimately is concerned with holding this balance between economic and social goals and individual and communal goals. And when we are the shareholder, the director, the manager, particularly in private and family businesses, and I know that COBRA has been supporting a number of businesses in that category already, along with obviously larger listed and more public-facing entities. As directors, we've got to make sure that through this process, we're balancing the role of the business. And I must say that through some of the engagement that we've had with businesses to date through this COVID-19 crisis, we've seen directors have a lopsided view of where this balance sits. And I think it's really important that as directors, as advisors, as shareholders, we understand these distinctions. You know, it's extensively recognized that governance increases your bottom line and the financial results achieved for shareholders and for other stakeholders. And I suppose in a crisis like COVID-19, we can tend to assume that the statement no longer applies, because if our business is failing, if we've got loss or significant losses that have been racked up on a monthly, a daily, a weekly basis, whatever the count or the run rate approach is for your business, we can look at this and go, hey, Carl, governance is no longer relevant because we're not going to achieve an increased bottom line because we're losing thousands, millions by the day. I suppose I look at this slightly more philosophically. And again, this comes back to this conversation about your board and your assumptions. And I'm going to give you some fairly practical guidance on how to approach that assumption decision-making or that assumption setting and the idea of expectations around that. But why I've still put this quote on the screen for you to reflect on is that in times like this, increasing your bottom line might be stopping you losing money. It might be the board getting to a faster decision around the way in which your particular business is responding to this crisis, whether that be mothballing it and essentially preserving what you can until the crisis flows through, whether it be liquidation and closing out because it's just past the gate of no return, and essentially improving the bottom line by ensuring shareholder and creditor assets are maximized, even though it might not be positive in terms of profitability. It's better than it otherwise would have been. Supporting you through the process by making some of the decisions you need to make faster and maybe to a deeper level than we're going to otherwise. So the point I'm making is think about the role of your board, and even if you are the only director sitting around the table, in the slightly more philosophical approach of, if we are losing money as a business today, how could we be losing less? And I think when you think about that, it brings an interesting perspective to the role of assumptions and the role of expectations through this process. One of the key challenges we see in this environment, and we see normally anyway, but it becomes even more so in an environment like this, is this inherent lack of understanding across business around these three hats of a shareholder, a director, and a manager, and which hat you're wearing when you're making particular assumptions and making particular decisions. And while today is not to deep dive into what we call the three hats and what the role of the three hats are, just for context for the discussion about assumptions and about expectations, I thought a 30-second insight would just provide some basis for that discussion. So inherently, at the end of the day, a shareholder invests for a return. And the decisions you're making during this process, wearing your shareholder hat, relate to the investment that you've made in the business, not about the operational decision-making, the governance, or the management of the business. The role of the director ultimately, and the role of the board, is to achieve this thing we call championing the promise. Promise coming from the language of company, enterprise, entrepreneurship, and the inherent role of a company. And I think sometimes, we get caught up that the role of a business ultimately is to make a profit. And I always say to people when we're running workshops and webinars on this topic as a deep dive, the role of promise in business, that making money is literally illegal. If you think about it, I suppose unless you're in Zimbabwe, printing money is literally illegal. And businesses, and the research clearly says that businesses that have a vision bigger than making money are those that are sustainable and more profitable in the long term. And I think even in the middle of COVID-19, understanding why you exist as a business and understanding what the promise, what the role as a board is that you're trying to deliver, supports you to have that view and carry you through. And we're spending quite a bit of time actually with boards, reminding them that even in times like this, understanding your core values as a business, understanding why you exist, and communicating that to your team is key to carrying your business through this environment. And then ultimately, the role of management is to bring the promise to life, to deliver on the operational outcome. And I'm happy as we go through this, if there are any questions that anyone does want to ask, otherwise we can go to a Q&A at the end of the presentation. But what I wanted to do here was just frame that as you make decisions, whether it be about business rescue, whether it be about liquidation, whether it be about how you respond to turning around your business and surviving this period, understand the different hats that you're wearing when you're making or setting the assumptions and the expectations you're basing those decisions on. So ultimately, whether we inherently or consciously do this or otherwise, on a daily basis, we are supporting, sorry, let me reframe this. On a daily basis at the Sadar Group, we're supporting and advising boards regarding assumptions that they're making, whether you're making these consciously or otherwise. And certainly we've sat down with people, and I know that the other panelists are seeing this in their respective roles and engaging with businesses as well, where you sit down, you start a conversation, and you say, so, what's your decision? Where are you at? What's your thinking? And there's a whole lot of assumptions that have been made subconsciously about where the business is at or what the business has to do or doesn't have to do because of lifelines, in many cases, that people are holding on to when it comes to this idea of decision-making, when it comes to this idea of setting assumptions. And so I want to just take a pause here and ask you and just create a little bit of engagement around this conversation. What is an assumption that you are currently making in your business around how you will or won't survive COVID-19? So I'm just going to stop the share for a moment there and just ask as attendees here, let's just put in the chat box. You can change it so it goes to everyone, or you can just share your comment with the panelists. What is an assumption you are currently basing your decision making on? So I'll give you an example. One of your assumptions might be that you're going to be able to go back to selling goods on the 15th of May as an arbitrary date. One of your assumptions might be that your shareholders will support you and provide the cash you need to get through this. So just for a little bit of context and to make sure that you're doing some of the thinking and some of the work through this process, just put in the chat box there, what is an assumption that you're making about how your business is or isn't responding to COVID-19 at the moment. Great, so a couple of thoughts coming through there. We're expecting to go back in May. Someone saying that they're not expecting 100% sales when they get back to being able to open the doors. Someone's saying we don't expect this to impact our business at all. Okay, great. Well, if there are any other thoughts as you're going through this around the assumptions that you're making, please share them in the chat box, and it would be great to engage through this process. So as we talk about assumptions, we at the COBRA group like to use this context of metaphors, because we find that having a metaphor for something just helps us connect the idea to an approach or to a thinking or to a way you can ensure that you're connected to the idea. So if you like, this assumption setting process as you're going through the decision making on how you respond to COVID-19 is all about that preparation at base camp, if you like, because it is the preparation at base camp, not during the climb, that gets you to the summit. In the COBRA group, we have set the 30th of September as our summit for this period. We, right at the beginning of COVID-19 hitting South Africa, back at the beginning of March, because in our business, just as context, we run a 31st of March financial year. So 1st of April is the first day of our new financial year. Wonderful timing, of course, this year. 1st of April is our new financial year. The 30th of September is our halfway mark for the financial year. So at the beginning of March, we had an all-team meeting for our entire team across the African continent. And I put up on the Zoom screen, just like I'm doing right now, a picture of my calendar of the 30th of September. And I said to everyone, print off the 30th of September calendar, whatever's in it in your diary, and put it up on your wall, because our summit is the 30th of September. Now, what is the preparation we are doing today to ensure that we get through this period and are able to sit at our half year and celebrate where we are at in terms of our financial year? Now, I get for different businesses, the impact of COVID-19 is very different. But the fundamental point coming out of this story for you as a business is two things. First of all, what does your summit look like? What is your future in this journey? And secondly, what is the preparation that you're taking today to ensure that you've got the foundation to get there? And so with this idea of assumptions in mind, your assumptions ultimately are based on historical experience. And so it's really important to interrogate your assumptions and say, what experiences are you referencing when you're making this assumption? What experiences are you referencing that are no longer relevant? So we've been talking to a number of boards through this process that keep referencing experiences from 5 years ago or 10 years ago when the business had a crisis and this or that are not relevant to the context the business is facing today, and therefore are no longer relevant to the current environment. So what assumptions are you making through this journey that where you're referencing, if you like, experiences that are no longer relevant? And thirdly, are you separating your assumptions out into the right hat? So when you sit back and look at your business, if you do wear all three hats, are you separating the hat as a shareholder and saying, my assumptions as a shareholder are that I'm not going to have to provide financial support to this business, that my guarantees will be called upon, and I will be in a position to fund this? Or are your assumptions that you're going to have to put in financial support, that you're able to put in that financial support, etc.? So wearing your shareholder hat, have you separated out those assumptions so that you can be clear on them? Because if you're not clear on those assumptions, you'll find it very difficult to then sit wearing your director hat and say, okay, so what assumptions are we making as a board about the journey that we're going through, about our access to capital, about when we're going to be able to trade, about what the impact of the South African GDP, if you're a South African-based business, is going to have on your business. And if you're looking for a reference point and thinking about some of that decision-making, the COBRA Friday afternoon webinar led by Lorenzo from Singular is a really valuable insight, in my view, the best in class, into what is happening in the South African economy and what are some of the impacts by industry that as a business you should be thinking about to be able to reference in terms of your assumptions. I'm a visual person, and as I said just before, having a reference point for metaphors is always valuable. And in this at our group, we often talk about the fact that the difference between now, if you like, the present, and the future being the other side of this crevice, or are your assumptions. And I love this visual of these ladders that they use in the journey to climb Mount Everest, that are just tied together, and you climb across this thing at 30, 40, 50, even 100 feet above the base of the crevice on these aluminium ladders that have to get you from one side of this crevice to the other. And when you think about it, our assumptions are really these ladders. Our assumptions are these ladders that are tied together, our series of assumptions that we make, that we're tying together, that really form the bridge for us between now and your future. And the question is, are those assumptions sound? Are those assumptions really strong and based on an insight and an understanding that gives you confidence to cross that bridge? And my colleague Roger, he refers to these assumptions as being, or this space being, the questions you have to answer are here in the gap. So in order for you to create a bridge from the present, from today, to the future, and to what your summit looks like, and to where you're trying to go, what are the questions that you have to answer in order to have confidence that you're going to have a bridge to cross? And be interested to get some of those questions, if you want to put them in the chat box. What are some of the questions that you feel you have to answer in order to create this bridge between now, the present, and indeed your future being the other side of this crevice? And once you understand what those questions are, you can start putting assumptions to them. So they might be assumptions on what's the impact going to be on your sales, what's the impact going to be on your industry, what's the impact going to be on your suppliers, what's the impact going to be on your price point, what's the impact going to be on your executive team, what's the impact going to be on your staff. If 30% of your team members have spouses who no longer have employment, is that going to create a challenge for your business? Is that going to create a challenge for your team members? Is that going to mean that you've got critical team members starting to look for other jobs because all of a sudden they have to increase their household income to cover the loss of employment of a spouse? Depending on your industry and depending on your business, defines the questions that you ultimately have to answer. And so in each of our hats, we've got different assumptions that we've got to make. So what assumptions are you making as a shareholder, or assuming about your shareholders and your other stakeholders, particularly in the context of a South African environment where we see governance as being much wider than just our responsibility and our relationship with our shareholders? As directors, are you documenting the assumptions that you are basing your decisions on? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the documentation of your assumptions, because this really is your key defense in any challenge that comes down the road, where someone says, a creditor says, a liquidator says, a major shareholder challenges you and says, as a board, you didn't respond appropriately, you didn't make the decisions that you needed to, you weren't you weren't effectively considering or fully considering the environment, and therefore you made decisions too late and destroyed our capital, or meant that the business wasn't able to repay us. You should have gone into business rescue sooner. You should have been liquidated sooner. All of those are challenges that you as directors might get, or wearing your director hat may get. And as a result of that, or the easiest way to manage that, if you like, is to ensure that you're documenting your assumptions through the process, because that is a key defense. And before I go to the assumptions you make as a manager, for anyone on the call who is a shareholder director, one of the biggest things that happens in an environment like this is we start making decisions wearing our shareholder hat that essentially remove the limitation of liability that sits around our company. We have a thing called a limited liability company, a limited company, PTY Ltd, for a reason. We have a limited company because we want to limit our liability as shareholders. But what happens, particularly where shareholders and directors wear the same, or where shareholders and directors wear both hats simultaneously, is we make decisions emotionally as a shareholder. For example, we say, look, we'll continue to trade because we believe we can get through this, and as a shareholder, I'll provide that support. But we effectively, through that process, start removing that limitation of liability, and we start creating an environment where we, through our actions, have opened up to unlimited liability as a shareholder. And we could get more technical about that if anyone wanted to deep dive on that. Happy to do so online or offline. The point I'm making is that risk is a result of the assumptions that you're making. And then ultimately, as a manager, you are turning the principles and the decisions into action. What information are you feeding up? What are your assumptions that as a manager you're making about the speed of execution? Are you going too slow? Are you going too fast? Are you making the board aware of critical issues or changes in the environment fast enough? Are you calling your board to the table when you need to, because the environment has significantly changed? The second aspect of this that I think is really important to consider in the journey are your expectations. While your assumptions are really based on your experiences, your expectations are your anticipation of what is to come. Your expectations, often in privately held or family businesses, are impacted by the emotional component of your decision making, of your engagement, of your experience, of your connection into this journey. So what expectations are you making? What expectations have you set of the future? What are you expecting to happen? What expectations are you making that are emotionally based? What expectations do you have that you have not voiced? We had a leadership team meeting within the SAR group early on in this process where I'd shared my assumptions and my expectations for how, as a business, we were going to navigate this blizzard. And one of my colleagues challenged me and he said, Carl, what has to happen in this process, because I probably, in sharing that with the leadership team, didn't necessarily share everything. I hadn't thought about some of the things, or hadn't voiced maybe some of my expectations consciously or not, as I shared earlier in this. I'm not perfect in this process. I'm leading a business through this journey myself. And so a lot of what I'm able to share in this is stuff that we're learning in the process of leading our own organization and leading or chairing the boards of large private and public institutions. And one of my colleagues said to me, Carl, this has to shift from being your assumptions and your expectation to being our expectations and our assumptions as a leadership team. And I think that was a really interesting moment for our team, for our leadership team early in the process, where as a result of that discussion, we got everyone to voice their assumptions and voice their expectations, and through that had a much richer understanding of how our business was able to respond. One of the things we've been running for some of our clients in this process is a COVID-19 workshop journey. And I thought sharing the agenda of this workshop that we're running with you, even if you were to use it in your own leadership of your own business, in terms of thinking about the sort of conversation we're having today, broken down into a series of discussions, because I don't think assumption setting and expectation setting in this environment happens in one go. To some degree, if you're late to the party, or you felt your early response wasn't aggressive enough, you didn't cut hard enough, you didn't want to believe the significance of the impact, you might have been one of those denialists around the fact that the lockdown was going to be extended, or it wasn't going to be a 3-week, you believed it was going to be a 3-week and then back to work. So sort of module 1 might still be really appropriate for you because you haven't actually addressed this. And, as I say, you could take these as questions yourself and break this down with your own leadership team, or if you are a shareholder manager, break this down with someone that you work with or that you pull to the table, or even one of the COBRA team, in thinking about your response. So really, module 1, each of these discussions really taking about an hour, framing the crisis and understanding your attention and how you're looking at it. Module 2, seeing through the storm, setting that picture of the future, setting that summit, setting that date that gives you and your team something to look forward to. And think about how you're linking your organizational values to your response. One of the examples of that for us as at the Sadar Group is one of our values is being a step ahead. And we were talking about whether we would close our offices across Africa or wait till the formal lockdown occurred in the different countries. And in the middle of this discussion, one of our management team literally said, guys, one of our values is being a step ahead. And in that moment, we got, like, the discussion ended. One of our core organizational values is being a step ahead. Why are we even discussing whether we would wait or not? We understand that this is the right thing to do. We closed our offices, and literally that day we announced it to the team, closed our offices and transitioned to work from home. I'm not saying that's what you should or shouldn't have done. What I'm saying is, how are you linking your response to your values and demonstrating to your organization, to your team, to your employees that you are a value-driven organization? Module 3 is ask yourself the questions about mapping relationships, about how you're going to navigate the storm. What are the conversations you need to have now? What are the conversations you're going to need to have later? And then module 4 is about, well, how do we break this down into a plan of action? How do you set a plan of action? How do you orientate your team on a plan of action that enables your business to respond effectively? And so this is an agenda we've been using. Happy for you to take it and use it in your own organization. If you want a hand with it, please feel free to reach out. I thought at this point in the discussion, it was worth just orientating us back on this idea of why we have a board. And then I want to go to a couple of practical How do you manage your liability through this process? And then we'll round off in time for a couple of questions. So ultimately, as shareholders, investors, the reason why when we invest in other companies, we expect there to be more than one or two directors. We inherently know that a board supports a business, supports its growth, and increases its value. And in a time like this, that is also true. And so my challenge to you, if you are a shareholder manager, if you are a family business, and you don't have someone you're having these conversations with, reach out to the COBRA team, say, hey, look, I might not need business rescue, because it's not just all about business rescue. N shared at the beginning, Maurice shared also at the beginning, that it's not about just ending up in business rescue. It's about how do we make sure we navigate you through that process and ultimately get you or not get you into business rescue if there's any possibility of avoiding it. So if you don't have a board, use COBRA as, so to sort of round off with some context, for some this will get nasty. We know that not everyone is going to effectively be able to navigate through this. We know that ultimately there will be some creditors, there will be some employees, there will be shareholders that mean that for you this could get nasty, and as I say, for some this will get nasty. Clearly understanding your assumptions and your expectations and being able to demonstrate that you did this throughout the process is your key protection. And really, in a South African context, one of the key get out of jail free cards for a board, and of course I put inverted commas around that, is not what was the decision you made, but how did you get to the point of making that decision? I think sometimes we think about a journey like this being about, or risk mitigation being about removing risk. In business, if we remove risk, we remove reward. Risk and reward are inherently the basis of business globally. And so there's nothing that will ever occur that will remove all risk, because if we remove all risk, we might as well go and put our money in a government bond, maybe in a government bond, and just take the risk-free rate. So for some, this will get nasty, and our reference for you here is, remember as a director, the three key pillars of care, skill, and diligence. What is your approach to decision-making? Do you have the skill, the knowledge, the commercial acumen, and the self-development to guide through this? And if you don't, as I say, reach out to COBRA and utilize the resources we have available to support you in that area. And diligence, preparation, and attention to detail, and the key part being there, documenting your decision making. So while we maybe go to some questions and some Q&A, maybe leaving this up on the screen, and then Maurice, I've got a final slide just to share at the end of the discussion this morning. But I always feel it's important that we reflect and document what has been our insight, and most importantly, what is the practical step that you are going to take today. And I'd love it if you were to share those things in the chat box. What has been your biggest insight today, and what practical step are you going to take today as a result of this discussion that we have had? So I'm going to stop sharing the screen for now, and happy to go to any questions and answers that there may be.
I see there's one here. Our product is needed and will be even more critical to South Africa when we emerge from this pandemic. We're lying low right now, but we'll survive and thrive when the time is right.
So I think that related back to some of the assumptions. So that's a great assumption to be making. You've clearly tested that assumption and have an understanding of the basis on which you're doing that. I would encourage you to model what your expectation is around what that demand will be. I always say when it comes to budgeting, whatever you expect your sales to be as a result of this, take the number and divide it by 2, and then reduce it a bit further, and then you'll get a base case. And I think an assumption in this scenario of a base case, and then your optimistic view will maybe just support you to make sure that you are really lying as low as you need to, or as low as you possibly can during this time?
Well, maybe I could chip in here, and thank you for separating out the various hats of the shareholder, director, manager. That's something that we do in every rescue because people forget. But one of the intriguing things, when you've got a board of directors, do not assume that all the directors are on the same page. Specifically, you know, and I'm dealing with a listed company at the moment. We've got 3 non-execs and 2 executives. The executives have a firm view that this company can be rescued or rather turned around in an informal process. But of course, what's in it for the non-execs? The non-execs are saying, put it into rescue. We need the protection. We're at risk of trading recklessly, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, you then get a conflict in the board where you might actually find, and I've warned the executive of this, is that the directors may take the decision to put the company into business rescue when in fact the executives are hell-bent on keeping it out. I don't know, observation on that, but it's just the practical thing that has come our way.
Yeah, Peter, we're seeing similar as we work with boards. Our starting point, and I'm sure you've done something similar in this process, is to try and understand or get people to agree what are the assumptions that the decision making has been made on. Because it's really easy for people in a boardroom to throw one-liners around. And my favorite one-liner is, you're getting too operational. And, you know, everyone uses this, you know, whether it be directors saying, oh, we're getting too operational because they really don't want to put in the work, or management saying you're getting too operational because they don't want the directors interfering. What does too operational mean, as an example? And if you haven't sat down and said, this is our definition as a board, then the comment has no reference. So really the challenge in an environment or in a discussion like, Peter, you're referring to, is to define the assumptions and see if there is a basis or at least some area of common ground, and then work through the areas where there's disagreement. And modeling it like that based on assumptions, we've found has been a way to sort of navigate the conflict and take it from being emotive statements like we're trading recklessly to, well, here are the facts, or here are the assumptions we can agree on, and these assumptions inherently mean A, B, and C.
We got another comment from Teresa. Key insights: to resist directing this on my own as majority shareholder and CEO, but to call on all other shareholders and personnel for their insights and recommendations. And I think that's really important. You know, it's about being a collective now, and it's about working together as a team. You know, top-down and top-down management in these circumstances can also prove to be difficult, because you, as a manager, are making very difficult choices apropos your staff. And I think those choices very often ought to be made by the staff, particularly when it comes to health-related issues. And I'm finding in my company that it's important to engage on that score, and to reach agreement, to reach consensus throughout the process.
Very much so. And I think, Teresa, just remember that word we've been using through this webinar today as well, of your third hat being your role as a director. So, you know, obviously I don't understand your particular circumstance, but if there are other people that either legally wear that hat as director, or wear that hat by definition, for example, as being a prescribed officer in your business because of the level of influence they have over the business, you know, there are other people that may have a legal responsibility to be part of that discussion. And I always find when you climb a mountain, if you're climbing as a team, you get there faster. And so bringing those people into the discussion and making them part of your team will get there, or support you to get there even more effectively.
If you have any questions on your side?
No, I'm not seeing any other questions here. The last slide to share was just simply bringing back that slide I shared earlier in the webinar of great directors, good directors grow businesses, great directors change lives. And I think in the role that we're all playing in our businesses, and I know, even Peter and Maurice and some of the team here are all directors of our own businesses. The challenge is really to say, what are you doing to have a positive impact through this journey on the lives of the people your business impacts? And I think sometimes we can get very caught up in business being a non-emotional impact, when at the heart of it, our role as directors is to deliver for our shareholders and, keyword, other stakeholders. So how are you going to be a great director and indeed change lives for the better through this process? So thank you for the opportunity, and happy to answer any other questions that anyone has offline, either direct them through the COVID website or reach out to us on Twitter, and more than happy to answer there as well.
Yeah, and I think on that score, it's important for the audience to be made aware that COBRA is about engagement. It's about our partners engaging with businesses with a view to assisting and utilizing our expertise wherever we can. So please reach out. We can also set up private Zoom meetings with you and your team to deal with specific issues that may have arisen. And that's from legal, accounting, strategic. We've put together a panel of associate partners, which really would, without a shadow of a doubt, prove to be of invaluable assistance to your business. So make use of that. I see some have questions come through. Thank you, pleasure. It's only a pleasure. We have these COBRA webinars all the time, and in fact, there's another one in 24 minutes dealing with insurance, and in particular employment insurance, and what about me as an individual, and it's dealing with the various funds. So please join. I'm posting a link to that webinar now to all attendees, so please copy that and join us literally in 24 minutes. I'd like to thank Carl and the other panelists for being here today. This was an absolutely fantastic chat, and we hope to see you back here soon. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, everyone.